Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's good, everybody? This is Joel Thomas, and this is Free the Rabbits. And how are all the free-range rabbits doing out there today? I'm pretty excited about this episode. I have got a guest today, and this is John from 21 CD Podcast, and I've had the pleasure with working with John on a film that is on the editing floor right now being worked on. John's a great dude. He's worked with Tony several times. And as a matter of fact, he'll be hosting the confessionals this upcoming Tuesday, which is a nice little string of weeks that Tony has given to some of his podcast friends to take over the podcast and show the world, you know, what we do on our podcast, which is pretty cool. But John, what's up, man? How you been, man?
I've been really good. I've been busy. Having a good time though. How are you?
Pretty good, man. I am sad. We were talking off air before we got on here, and you said that you were a little bummed out because you saw I did an episode, Cryptids of the Corn, about trolls, and you were just in Iceland again looking for trolls. So it probably would have been good to have you on there with us. I didn't even know you were doing it until later, until, you know, I'd already booked them for the show. So how'd that go, man? You know, how did the trip go?
Oh man, it was awesome, and I love no shade to the Cryptids guys. I love the Cryptids of the Corn guys. One of my favorite podcasts. But I saw that episode and I was like, dang, I could have done something there. But yeah, so I went to Iceland. This will be my second time. I think it was last month now. And I originally went there to look for the hidden people, which are basically a species, for those who don't know, that are an entity of some sort that are in between humans and basically elves or the Fae. They're basically this human-like cryptid that lives in the earth in Iceland. And they've got a society that's based around them and all that kind of stuff. So I went there to hopefully capture that. But what I actually ended up capturing, I think, is something different, and it may be evidence that trolls completely overran Iceland at one point. And in my opinion, I think trolls could be a number of things, maybe giants, maybe fae, but everything I was seeing points to that maybe at some point Iceland was actually some kind of Nephilim stronghold, which is absolutely crazy to think about. And that's what my documentary is going to probably focus on when I finally get it out.
Yeah, man, that's very interesting. And the Nephilim connection with a lot of this stuff is always very prevalent. I did talk to Cryptids of the Corn on the podcast about trolls, and we mapped out a bunch of different ways how trolls can exist. And I don't think all trolls are the same. And I think that, yeah, there's probably this version that is this Nephilim version. But then I think there's maybe some other versions as well. And maybe some that get, looked at wrongly. Maybe someone thinks it's a troll and it's actually something else. So we talked about that too. We know the Fae can masquerade as a lot of different things, especially when they're trying to trick human beings. So I think that was something that we talked about a lot too, that some of these stories about trolls seemed very Fae-like, that they were shape-shifting and doing things that weren't typical troll behavior, or at least were what we've read throughout history about trolls. But I'm very curious about this documentary. It's going to be very interesting. Anything with the Nephilim always gets me pretty excited. So if you found some sort of connection with them being there, which, I mean, it would make sense. I mean, why not? So
yeah, I mean, basically what happened in Iceland was there was a volcanic apocalypse and everything that was there burned. And so in my opinion, I don't see how, if during maybe a flood-like era, when these creatures, these entities, these the Nephilim, if they were wandering around on the planet and they needed to be wiped out, which clearly God thought they needed to be wiped out at one point, why wouldn't there be a mini apocalypse on Iceland where all these things are stuck? You know what I mean? And then maybe that's when a number of other things happened, like when the geysers in the deep opened up and the earth changed and everything was moving all over the place and islands were sinking and all that kind of stuff, and Atlantis was lost and all that. That could all be part of this same exact moment. So very interesting stuff. I'm really excited to show you what we got.
yeah, man, it sounds great, and I'm all about it. And I'm all about anything weird. And I am pushing for Merkle Media to, in the next couple of years, to start venturing out from the States. So that's my goal anyway. So I'm trying to get to the Philippines, where Dogman is very prevalent in the Philippines. I just found this out recently. I didn't know that Dogman is just running rampant over in the Philistine, over there.
Really?
Yeah, dude, it's wild. So one of my good friends, he is getting married to a Filipino woman, and he's been over there a bunch, and he's just talking to the locals. Yeah, it's just be walking in the backyard or something. I'm like, what? Like, this is crazy. And they have these, I don't know the Filipino name for this, and I believe he told me, but I don't know what it is. But there are these like massive bird-like creatures that will just be flying over them, and they'll try to capture like kids and stuff, but they're supposedly have some sort of correlation with witches. So they will shapeshift into witches, which
Sounds
I think
like
is
the Jersey Devil, bro.
I thought of that too, and also thought of Lilith. That was the other thing that I thought about as well, because Lilith's been said to have bird-like feet and can shapeshift. So I thought that was super interesting, that over there in the Philippines, there's just like cryptids galore over there. I didn't even know it was like that. So now I'm trying to push for that and push for South America. I'm trying to push for all over the place, man. So I'd like to look back in 10 years and say, man, I've been all over the world looking for all kind of cool stuff.
Absolutely. There's a lot of stuff going on in South America, man. I've been down there 9 or 10 times, and it's just I get videos all the time from my family down. I have family down there, and I get videos all the time that they're sending me. Hey, have you seen this? Have you talked about this on your podcast? And yeah, like there's just the Latin cultures. And we're going to get into that today, actually, because a lot of what I captured, I know you and we have this goal to discuss this topic to discuss in mind, but a lot of my information for this specific topic came from South America. And so I think that, there's a ton of weird stuff to find down there.
Yeah. And I think too, for people that are listening, and we're about to jump into the topic at hand, called American Egypt, and the idea that Egyptians had cultures all through the Americas. And I say the Americas, so I don't mean just in North America, which I think there's some pretty good evidence that they were here in North America with some pretty large cities, but also in South America as well. And I think that is pretty obvious by some of the info that I know you're going to present today. And I actually have a very interesting story as well about South America and ties to Solomon. So that'll be pretty cool to go into as well today. But I think that there's a couple different camps when it comes to this Egyptian topic in the conspiratorial world, and specifically North America, but just the Americans in general. You got one camp, which is what we're about to talk about today, this particular part of the theory that Egypt migrated here to, which wouldn't have been called the States back then, but the States now, and set up all kind of mining all around North America and cities and culture. And that's one side of it, right? That they had their primary setup in what we know as Egypt today, where the Great Pyramids are at and all that good stuff. But then there's another camp that believes that ancient Egypt actually was in the Americas, specifically Florida, and how that the Garden of Eden was in Florida, and how that the Mississippi River is the Nile. I'm sure some people that are listening right now have heard some of these deep dives. There's several people online that have done some deep dives on that particular topic that believe that. I can say, me personally, I'm not in that camp. I have heard it all, and I just don't know if that evidence can outweigh what has happened over in Africa. It's just, to me, it doesn't make sense, especially because I come from a biblical perspective, and there's too much geography talked about in the Bible that doesn't match up with places here in the States. And we're not going to talk about any of that today, really, but to preface before we start today, we are not talking about the United States being Egypt, like actual Egypt. That's not what we're talking about today. And I know there's a lot of different groups of people out there. Hoteps would be a big one. The Moors is another one. Hebrew Israelites, some of them believe that here in the States, this is where Egypt was at. And there's some other great researchers that also believe that. And I don't throw it all out. I'm not saying that there isn't some interesting info there, and it's possible, but I think it's more probable that Egypt had spread out all across the world. And I think people forget that these ancient people knew a lot about navigating the seas. Mm-hmm. And for some odd reason, Smithsonian always wants to just destroy the actual history here in the Americas. You know, we're never really going to know, John, actually what happened. We won't. You and I are going to speculate all day and do all this kind of research. At the end of the day, we're never going to know the truth. None of us will. And
exactly. And that's part of the reason that this is like a tough topic to swallow for, I think, a lot of people, is because even if you find the evidence, no, you didn't, because it will be whisked away by the Smithsonian, who is here to let us all get on the same page. The Smithsonian is here to craft the narrative. They are the script writers. They are the narrative writers of North America. Obviously, North America is, whatever it is to the rest of the world. So maybe they have their little fingers over in UNESCO and other places that go global. But primarily, I think the Smithsonian's literal only goal is to masquerade as a museum, when in actuality, it is a tool that the powers that be have used to craft our history books for all the little children to consume and to learn completely wrong things about the world that they grew up in. And so I'm also 100% on the same page as you. I have been doing a little bit of research on this topic prior to this episode, but I, in all of my research, have not found anything that seems to align with the idea that Egypt started out in the United States or in North America anywhere. I do think, yeah, you're right. It was probably a group of Egyptians who mind you, were probably here for quite some time, but they started as a small group, just like the Vikings, just like all these other groups of people who just wanted to see what was out there. And they ended up in North America. It's a pretty big place. It's kind of hard to miss it. So I think that's what happened. And that's why we see the evidence here that we do.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, man, because there is a lot of evidence of the Smithsonian covering up a lot of this Egyptian culture and artifacts. And I'm going to talk about a lot of that today. And as I was gathering a lot of info for this particular episode, and I had been gathering some info, but I was digging more, just getting my notes together. And it was so crazy the amount of people that were involved with different parts of where these Egyptian artifacts were found that worked for the Smithsonian or were Smithsonian adjacent. And then the Smithsonian would come out and say, no, they didn't work for us. We don't know who that is.
G.E. Kinkaid. Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. So you have G.E. Kinkaid, right? It's G.E., right? You have
That's
Mr.
right.
Kinkaid who discovered this, I think it was 1912 or something, where he allegedly found this cave in the Grand Canyon where there was a host of Egyptian relics and hieroglyphs on the wall. And basically, we're led to believe that the only proof of this, the alleged proof, is this newspaper article that just told the whole story. And now we have entire portions of the Grand Canyon that are just completely locked off. And we've all seen it, I'm assuming. We've all seen the Blackhawks in the air if you go too far. But it's not just that. It's also the flooding. It's the natural barriers that exist too. So wherever this place was extremely hidden, I think, and hard to find. And explorers who have managed to get to that location do say that there do appear to be remnants of concrete platforms that were essentially placed on the cliff above this cave that are, obviously it's speculation, but were maybe used to mount a crane or something like that to lift artifacts out of the cave. And I'm sure you have way more knowledge on that because I didn't focus specifically on the cave, but I did find something else relating to a potential sect of Egyptians that came up through South America and basically had a hand in. They met the Aztecs, they met these people, they met all these people, and they came up to the cave. And there's allegedly an entrance to the inner earth there as well. So in a way, you have this idea, because these ancient people, their most notable descendants nowadays would be like the Cherokee. They have tales of this entrance to the hidden earth inside the Grand Canyon. And I find that very interesting when you compare this alleged story of Kinkaid, which for all we know could be a pseudonym. And that's why they don't have any record of him working there, is because A, he was trying to cover his butt and didn't use his real name, or B, they covered his butt because they didn't want anybody to know this was real. But you align that with this Native American tale, the Cherokee, and there's like 50 other tribes who have this same exact story, which is also interesting, of an inner earth entrance in the Grand Canyon. And they have a whole portion locked off. It does really make you wonder, okay, well, if it's not a sarcophagus with King Tut in it, what is it? Right?
Right. No, for sure, man. And yeah, you jump right in the deep end with the Kinkaid's cave. It's all good because I have a lot on Kinkaid's cave. I have several different tunnels and caves we're going to talk about today.
Awesome.
And for sure, Kinkaid's cave, because it's fascinating how that particular incident was in an actual Gazette, a newspaper, which I'm going to read from today. I'll actually read some of the article of what was said, because Kinkaid wasn't the only one involved with finding this. And there were other people that were connected to him that were pronounced to work for the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian had to come out and say that they didn't. So that was even crazier because these people are actually documented people, not pseudonyms. So it's very strange, but I did want to backtrack a tad bit, but we're going to focus on the Grand Canyon to start with for sure.
Right.
But I want to talk about these places that are in the Grand Canyon that are named after Egyptian gods, which is even crazier when you think about it. They've got a place called Osiris's Temple. It's like elevation's over 6,000 feet. You've got the Horus's Temple, which is another high elevation over 6,000 feet. You've got the Tower of Ra, another one over 6,000 feet. You have the Temple of Set, which is part of this little grouping with Osiris and Horus, which that whole connection is very interesting because Osiris is the father of Horus and Set. So you've got this little grouping, and then you start tracking down who named or who supposedly, and I'm going to say supposedly, named these high plateaus, these very odd Egyptian names. There's a guy named Thomas Moran, and he's actually one of the premier painters in all of American lore as far as landscapes go. And he was born in the early 1800s. He died in the early 1900s. And he moved here from England with his family, but he was very, very creative. And he was one of the catalysts that helped turn the Yellowstone region into the first national park in 1872 because his paintings were so beautiful of Yellowstone that Congress decided to establish it. And there's a lot of controversy around this guy too, right? Because one of the things that he was known for doing was making the West look spectacular for the settler. Oh yeah, I got to go out there. It looks great. These paintings. But what he would do, he would omit things out of the paintings in the areas that he was painting, like mines and railroads and the destruction that we were causing. Well, giants too, I'm sure.
Mounds, pyramids,
mounds, all
Greco-Roman architecture, all sorts of stuff.
Absolutely. And just on a basic level, he was known for lying in his paintings when it came to the indigenous people, the Native Americans that lived here.
So he's a propagandist.
Absolutely. He was a propagandist painter, is what he was.
Loser. You never suspect the painters.
I know, man. It's so crazy, though. But yeah, he was the guy that this is mainstream now, is saying that named these plateaus after these Egyptian gods. And it doesn't make a lot of sense, John. Like, why are we naming in the Grand Canyon? And they're not all after Egyptian gods, by the way. Majority is, even though there is a temple of Shiva, which is really strange. There's a temple of Shiva in the mix with all of these Egyptian gods. Now, if we want to go down the rabbit hole of the Elohim and the
Shiva
rebranding,
is that Persian Shiva, or is that Canaan? What is that? Where's the origins of that?
Shiva. Well, I mean, if we're talking about Elohim, I mean, the name change, the rebranding could have gone all the way back to the beginning of time. But if we're talking about Shiva, we're talking about Hindu, we're talking Indian, which is really weird.
And didn't they, I'm sure you'll talk more about it, but in that article, didn't it actually say that, and sorry, before I was mistaking Shiva with Sheba, but didn't they actually find a statue of like a Buddha-like figure or something like that?
That was one of the first things that they saw. Now, I don't know if that particular item that they found was Buddha or if that's just what Kinkaid thought initially, because that's at the beginning of the article. And as the article goes, it starts breaking down into more Egyptian like items. That's not to say that there weren't other cultures here too. So we got to throw that in the mix. But yeah, you're right. Initially, he said that he thought that this was a Buddha-like statue that they found when he first walked in.
So a couple things come to mind, and they're mainly questions. So I apologize if they go nowhere. But having something called a temple, so you have these peaks, which these mounts, which they're calling temples. That implies you can go inside them. In my mind, immediately I'm thinking, oh, okay, it's a temple, so I can go inside that. Like when I go to Colorado, which is where I'm from right now, I live in Wisconsin. But when I go to Colorado to climb the Rockies, they don't call those temples. They're called peaks. And they're called mountains, and they're not called temples. And so what I do wonder, and I know that we don't always mean things literally, but in the age where the Smithsonian is speaking in code, they're beginning to speak in code, because everything that the Smithsonian is saying and everything that they are putting out, it's only a mystery to us. And it's not even supposed to be a mystery to us. We're supposed to just take it as truth. But the powers that be, they know that the Smithsonian is speaking in code. So when there are mounts named after deities from other worlds, and they're called temples, not only is this a place of worship, but it's a place that we could possibly go into. And then I start to wonder, well, was the Grand Canyon terraformed? Is this not something that was like this, from the beginning or since the flood? Was it actually mined? Was it cut out? Obviously the river is there, so now there's a river there, but was it always? And one of the things that I did research was that while the Egyptian empire was flourishing in its heyday, basically throughout its heyday, the Grand Canyon was pretty much exactly like it is now. If you're going to take modern science into consideration, the erosion would not have been so severe that if we went to the Grand Canyon back then when the Egyptian empire was flourishing, we wouldn't really notice a difference if we visited it tomorrow. So I find that very interesting, and it just raises more questions about other places in the United States that are also named after Egypt. There's a place like 2 hours from me, which is a literal replica city of Giza. And it's kind of like, why? And then you go to places like Memphis, Tennessee, where they have a massive pyramid there. And it's like owned by Bass Pro. And you're like, okay, interesting, but why? That doesn't make any sense. If anything, it should be modeled after a big cabin in the woods like mine is here in Wisconsin. So why is it a pyramid? Why is it called Memphis? And you find out that people who were building the cities back in what I called the Tartarian age were really just modeling everything off of these architectures and these cultures inspired by these ancient gods, because I believe that everything comes from Mount Hermon. So everything that has happened is pretty much thanks to the Watchers descending, and basically they're not all friends, by the way. They all descended together, but they hate each other just as much as they hate God, I think, a lot of the times. Father God, Yahweh, Creator. So I do think that is where it all started. And when these things are called temples and there's the idea of an inner earth entrance there, that whole place could be the city, and it's underground. That's why we don't see anything, because it's underground. Sorry, that was a rant there.
No, it's very interesting. And one day I'm going to pick your brain about Tartary and see what you think about that. It's a whole different rabbit hole, and that would be like a whole other episode. I'm very much in the camp of, I'm not saying no, but I don't think it's what was thrown out at us a few years back either. I think there's some part of this manipulation going on. It just reminds me too much of these theories that kind of come out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden everybody's on it like rabid dogs, and you can't really find the truth of what might have actually happened because it's so much dissension with the topic. And I do think that there's some interesting things that don't make sense, But then I do think there's some things that can be easily proven that you can say, well, yeah, this happened, but it's not necessarily this. I'm not trying to get off subject here, but I'm curious kind of what you think about Tartaria, because it's a red button hot topic in the conspiratorial world. It's very much like the Mandela effect, or very, very, very much like flat earth. Any of those topics where it's so divided and people can't stand each other if they disagree on it.
Yeah. So let me clarify. But I don't believe in the kingdom of Tartaria. That's not what I believe in. What I believe in is that there was and I don't believe that there was a mud flood either. So I don't think a mud flood came and just half of our cities are buried underneath. And if we just dig a little bit deeper, all our buildings will get bigger. That to me is absolute hogwash, total nonsense. And yeah, so if you talk about Tartaria just briefly, yep, you're just, okay, we'll put him over there with the flat earthers. But what I really mean, and I say the Tartarian age mainly because that's the way that most people will understand what I'm talking about. But I believe that there was a couple watchers, maybe two, maybe a couple more, that descended onto Mount Hermon. And this leads into the Grand Canyon as well. So I think I can spend a little bit of time here. But and they were basically what would become the Greco-Roman gods. So obviously Greek first, and then Rome came and sort of elaborated. But I think that these watchers, all of them are independent beings with thoughts, feelings. I think they can love each other. I think they can hate each other. I think they do whatever they want. They have free will, and they chose to fall. They chose to descend. But prior to that, they were in a position of perfection in God's eyes. And I think that they chose not, because what we had seemed better, despite us being cursed, essentially. And so I think they descended to the earth, and they did all the things that Genesis 6 and, a lot of what the book of Enoch says they did. And during that time, a couple of them broke off from the group, and they later became this Greco-Roman Empire. And their power, their influence over the earth, which may have triggered a number of resets. We really don't know how many resets occur. I mean, we could even envision the Mandela effect as a reset. Because we don't know what happened, but something happened. And so this era that they had this dominion over their parts of the earth, and that's why Greco-Roman architecture is everywhere. I was thinking about this today when I was driving around, and I was just kind of like, how am I going to explain the fact that Greco-Roman architecture is everywhere if I say it's natural? So how would you naturally explain Greco-Roman architecture all over the world? And the answer is just, it's pretty, because it's not more practical. It's not. You can just put a pillar. I mean, you can drive down your neighborhood. Every balcony or every porch has pillars on it, and none of them are Greco-Roman, and none of them are carved with fancy, elaborate things. These were temples that were all over the world. And now we use them as post offices. And now we use them as Capitol buildings and stuff like that. And a lot of those churches went up in the 1800s. I think that's all part of this influence that these watchers had over the earth. And around the mid 1800s to the early 1900s, power shifted, and those empires fell. The Roman Empire fell. It became the Vatican, and other things around the world changed, and dominion over America also changed. And that's why now we're in a very brutalistic sort of society, focused on consumption and all that, where before it was on beauty. But I think part of this process was the uprooting of the Egyptian culture that was here, because these explorers came and they brought more people and they built temples in the Grand Canyon and all that kind of stuff. I think that was kind of uprooted with the Great Reset, that also uprooted this idea of Tartaria, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that a lot, actually.
Okay.
Because I'm in the camp with you that I'm not. Yeah, the mud flood thing is just so easy to disprove if you really just look at it with objective eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that mud floods have existed for eons, man. We know that mud floods happen, but there wasn't some massive mud flood that just covered the whole earth. Also, I guess being a Christian, it's tough for me to buy into a society that is supposed to be better than us in every way, that was creating free energy, that was helping us build a utopia. But they were giants. And somehow these elites of today took out these giants. Right.
Right.
Like, bro, like, it's just, they would be working in conjunction together. It would not be a situation where the elites are taking out these Nephilim, and it doesn't work that way, because the Nephilim, especially in a lot of their current states, which would be in spirit form and demonic entities, they would be puppeteering people in power. It wouldn't operate like that. And again, I'm not here to say that, because I know people listening to me right now, like, you've done a ton of episodes on good Nephilim. You know Nephilim can be good. Yeah, but it's also few and far between. And I've said that a million times. That's not the go-to. You're not going to see that a whole lot. It generally, Nephilim come from very brutal backgrounds and are raised a certain way, and they stay that way. You see rare instances throughout history where we can point to these good giants, and I've done some massive deep dives on that. But we're talking about an entire nation that's covering half the world at least, or more. People think pretty much they set up shop everywhere, that were led by giants. And it just doesn't make sense, man. There's so much of it that doesn't. Now, I will say this. When I've looked at the old maps of Tartary, one of the things that stuck out to me was this. What if that particular region that's mapped out, what if it wasn't above ground? What if that's underground? What if that plays into Tartarus, which we know from the Greek and the Bible as being an underworld, a place for these spirits to dwell, or God knows what else, right? So if we believe in an inner earth, or at least massive caverns that are all over the world, then maybe that's a possibility. And maybe they were giants. Maybe that was a civilization that was underground, and maybe that's the real psyop. Maybe it's not that it covered the world and they were ruling the world. Maybe this was a civilization that was mapped out, that was underground. And that's just my thoughts on the matter. And I know we deviated off, because I'm telling you, man, Tartary is one of those ones. It gets mentioned and you got to talk about it.
Bro, it's like Middle Earth, man. I don't. We're going to go off the deep end here in a second, but I literally, what you're saying right now is resonating so hard with me, because I am starting to believe that stuff isn't coming from up. It's coming from down. And I think there is stuff up, and I think stuff can come from up, but what we are talking about is coming from down and from within. And I think that, the reason that we can never get the disclosure from these government agencies who come out to drop a new truth bomb on us is because nothing they say actually ends up making sense, because these things aren't coming from outer space. Whatever, I go everywhere with it, from cryptids to obviously Admiral Byrd and his experiencing the inner earth, and all of the stories and mythologies from the North American natives themselves, who have stories of giants coming out of the middle of the earth and essentially tearing this land asunder. I'm almost of the opinion, and this is an interesting correlation, nobody take it the wrong way, but it does sound like, when you think about North America in this light, it sounds a little bit like the Promised Land before the Israelites went in it. And they were told that once you get there, you're going to have to smite literally everything, because that place is a wasteland and those people will kill you, and they're evil, and they may or may not even be people. We don't know what they are. So you're going to have to kill everything so they don't intermingle with you. And so they don't eat you, because they were cannibals. And I think a very similar thing happened here. It's very interesting when you look at the ancient Aztec and Maya studies, because their oral history is really, really, honestly quite fascinating. And I'm sorry if it's a little out of turn, but basically, what they kind of believe is that Atlantis sank, and Atlantis was somewhere between South America, South Central America, and Africa. Okay, and some of their ancestors went to Africa, and some of them came here. They basically went opposite directions off of this Atlantean island when it was sinking, and these people are the Atlanteans. They later became slaves, and they also may or may not have brought tales of, like, I don't know, the Anunnaki or something to Syria, right? But when they came to Central America and South America, they encountered giants and monsters in this land. And they had to go up through Central America, what is now known as Aztec territory. And you can go to Mexico and you can see all the temples yourself and try to figure out what they mean. But the idea is that maybe these Aztecs and these Mayans, they were something different. They weren't exactly 100% human. And I was going to ask you if you've heard of the copper-blooded people.
No.
You heard? Okay, so this is a really interesting Aztec history. Cut me off whenever you want. But these people came up from South America, especially the descendants of Aztecs, maybe Maya, and among some others, including these smaller tribes, the Chichimecha, and maybe the Malinaucha, and they brought their basket weaving culture with them, their bow hunting, and that's a lot of what we see out of Native American tribes. And it's sort of an example of technology given by the Watchers, because that's what this is. This is a killing device. This was given by a Watcher. And they bring this to North America, right? And they moved into the West and the Southwest, and they became people known as the Anasazi, maybe the Cahokia, some Algonquin-speaking tribes. Some of them went west, and they became the Cherokee, and they mined copper out of the Great Lakes, and they did all that kind of stuff. But the Aztecs have stories of how they were at war with giants during this time. And that was a big reason that they had to go north, is because they had to escape these giants. Unbeknownst to them, there were also tribes of giants running rampant in North America, but they didn't know that at the time. So they go up there, they flee from the giants. There's a 1,000-year war. And during this time, they've developed this breed of woman, and they called them the copper-blooded women. And these copper-blooded women were essentially traded to the giants, the Nephilim, or whatever you want to call them, maybe the Watchers themselves. And those were there. And from those women, they got their offspring. And those offspring were royalty. And they were the Nephilim, and they were the demigods. They were the Hercules, and they were the Silver Surfers of the world. And they were all that kind of stuff. And some of these people, including the Algonquin tribes, according to the oral histories at least, started experiencing what they call these visions to go wherever they have to go. And some of them found inner earth entrances and stuff like that. So that's kind of how I'm leaning when it comes to these people getting into the area to fight the giants. And later the giants were killed. And we see, like Lovelock Cave and stuff like that. I think those are examples of the last giants to be killed from North America. But I think one of the reasons that the history has to be erased is because when the colonizers finally got here, they realized that this place was it was running rampant with gods and Nephilim, gods and their sons and daughters. Like, it was just a crazy wasteland. They couldn't survive here. That's what I think.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I do lean towards there being, for sure, a lot of giant tribes here. And it's not that hard to dig up a bunch of articles from the late 1800s or even early 1900s where they're talking about giant bones being found all through the states. Some of them have pictures. It's, again, not that hard to find if you know where to look online. So we know that these giant bones have been around. I think there's still giants that live on Earth today, if not under the earth in some remote places of the world, for sure. Even here in the States, especially when you're looking at the Rockies and some of these places where even the Native Americans now say they've seen them, in these places. So I do agree with you there. I think it was a conglomeration of different cultures that were here. And this will lend back to what we're talking about today, this American Egypt. But I do think that there was an Egyptian culture here. I also think the Moors were here. I think there's a good argument for the Moors being here as well. And I think that leads into the idea that the African slave trade was just a minor part of what the slaves that were procured from the Europeans came from. I think that there were a lot that were here in the States already. And I think this goes back to what you talked about when the Europeans came over here. It was a lot going on. You had giant tribes, you had Moors who, from all accounts, if you go down that rabbit hole, they had some pretty technological, for the times, civilizations that were here in North America. You had Native American tribes everywhere, probably remnants from Egyptian tribes, all that stuff, right, going on here. So it's not as simple as what the Smithsonian is trying to sell us on it being Native Americans and that's it. Like it's not possible because the Native Americans aren't even talking that.
No. And when you try to explain to me how people look at anywhere in the world, literally anywhere in the world, and compare it to the progress that was made in North America by these Native American tribes, there's none. There's none. They came here living in teepees. They left here living in teepees. There's no progress whatsoever. And to me, that is none. I'm serious, none. You didn't even invent, they barely invented horse-drawn carts. Think about that. That's crazy that you have all of this time. Because when you try to explain, when they try to tell you, well, they built the pyramids because all they had was time. They didn't have day jobs or stuff like that to worry about. They just had all this time on their hands. Okay, well, so did the Native Americans, and they didn't even build a house out of wood. So tell me what's going on here. But when you look in the South, in the Southwest, when you look at the Anasazi people, they built way up high in places that people can barely even get to today, human beings. And they say they did that because they were actually hiding from giants. And this was the only way that the giants couldn't get to them. And these are now the Pueblo people, of course. But back then, they were the Anasazi. And if you look at the history of the Anasazi, which is one of the greatest North American empires to ever exist, by the way, but they won't tell you that. But despite the fact that these people built fortresses and castles and had trade routes to Cahokia all the way in the Great Lakes, and they were literally a 14-day hike from the Grand Canyon. And they were probably descendants of the Aztecs. But what's really, really interesting is that they just vanished without a trace. Nobody knows where they went. And you can go there and you can see what's left of their cities. And when you listen to their descendants talk about these cities, they talk about how they had to build portals, and entities would come out of these portals in their temple structures and communicate with them. Or, because it seems like this was a very troubled people, the Anasazi, they had to feed the monsters. And when you look at the Anasazi history, the way they ended was by cannibalism. That's what they say. They say they ate themselves. And they say that it's because of poison corn, but no, it's not. The giants ate them, obviously. Then, that's what I believe. And sometimes they'll say, well, the Aztecs, some of their Aztec cousins came up and ate them. Why? That's not the way that Aztec people were, but that is the way that the history wants you to believe. They want you to believe that these savages were so savage that they were eating each other. Are you serious? Even tribes in the Amazon that eat each other, tribes I've seen with my own eyes, even these people don't just eat each other because they're hungry. It's a ritual thing. So when you go to these Anasazi sites and you see evidence of the old kingdom that was here before and they were eaten to death, that's probably a Nephilim invasion. That's probably something like that. You know, that's that's the way I view that. But of course, the Smithsonian can't tell you that. They can't tell you there's kingdoms here that span the northernmost region, the Great Lakes, all the way to the south, to Central America, and that to survive, these people had to fight the giants. And I mean, we don't even know. The Egyptians were a giant worshiping culture in a way. And so maybe they brought some of them with them when they came here. Because one interesting thing that we have to consider is not every Egyptian knew how to mummify. This was a very specific skill set that the people who did mummify pharaohs and stuff were very, very well respected. And I would imagine that if there were Egyptians here, they probably had an abundance of help because they had many different types of worker here, including the most elite. You don't just mummify regular people in Egyptian culture. Not everybody's getting mummified. Some of those people are just being dropped in the dirt. The important ones are being mummified, and they're mummified by experts. And that's just another reason that I think if Kinkaid actually did find that stuff in the Grand Canyon, it would be evidence that there was a substantial Egyptian branch here. And they probably took giants with them to help them in that endeavor.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that around full circle back to Kinkaid. And we're going to talk about several of these caves here. I wanted to talk about what we just were on earlier about these plateaus that were named these temples. And I told you a caveat how that Thomas Moran was said to have created the names for that, this famous painter. But there was other sources that said that there was a George Wharton James, and he kept in tradition of Clarence Dutton of naming geographical features in the Grand Canyon after mythological deities. Now, George Wharton James, he was a lecturer, photographer, journalist, editor, and he was also a fraud of a Methodist preacher. And he got caught with real estate fraud, fake credentials, sexual misconduct, all that. He even got defrocked from the church and then later was reinstated, which I found that interesting. When guys get reinstated and they have heavy ties to the government, like he did. So I thought that was interesting enough. Here's this shady character, and here's another guy that could have come up with these names. So then I see one of his idols, which is Clarence Edward Dutton, and he was a geologist and U.S. Army officer, and he graduated from Yale, and he started what was called the Cosmos Club, and it was a gentleman's club back in 1878, and it was for people who are interested in science. And he started it with, you'll never believe this, John Wesley Powell of the Powell Cave. Okay. So this is getting crazier now. So now I'm like, okay, here's this tie-in to naming these plateaus in the Grand Canyon after these gods, and they're the temple of these gods. And they start this Cosmos Club. And as I'm digging, I'm going to have to do a whole episode about the Cosmos Club at some point because it was so much info and there were so many people I was running across that were part of this club. I mean, you could even tie in the Theosophy Society and Thelema and all these occult religions into the Cosmos Club, even though on the outside it just looks like, hey, we're just a bunch of scientists that like talk about cool stuff. And it's like, no, you're a secret society to some extent.
You're a cult.
And for sure. And it was a lot of very recognized people in their scientific fields that were all together in this. Now, they didn't allow women until, I want to say, like the late 1980s. But when they did, some of those women were very interesting as far as what they were involved in when it came to the occult. And again, the Cosmos Club itself is not an occulted society on the front, right? We know nothing of it having really anything to do with the occult outside of the fact there's some shady individuals that are a part of it and they are involved in the occult, which makes you wonder, what kind of info are these scientists sharing with each other? So we've got this backdrop of the Grand Canyon and these precipices named after these gods, these temples for these gods. I kind of lend to what you just said earlier. Is there a way inside it? Probably, because they blocked off a lot of the Grand Canyon. We don't even know half of it right now and what's even in there anymore because they blocked it off. So we're going to jump to the Kinkaid cave now because that's going to get us back to Powell. And again, I just thought that whole Powell thing was just nuts. Like, how is this connection between another guy that they said came up with these names and he's best friends with Powell, who started this Cosmos Club where they're, rubbing elbows with each other and giving each other all this different information and all of this different stuff, right? It's crazy.
Yeah, I haven't actually heard of the Cosmos Club, so I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I've only barely scratched the surface with it when I was doing research for this, and I thought the name was interesting enough. And then when I started digging through it, I mean, there's just a massive list of people that are a part of it. And I'm going to have to go through it thoroughly and just see, what it actually was and what it did. Because again, just on surface level, it doesn't look like there's anything super occulted to it.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's going to be something behind the scenes, if anything. But you get a bunch of people who are well recognized in their field and you put them all together, you're putting them in there for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's some sort of think tank, right? I don't think it's just a club. I think it's definitely a think tank in how that they can move the minds of the people around them into shaping a reality of history. And I think that's a lot of what these secret societies or clubs or think tanks are to do. They are to help shape us into what they want us to be.
Mm-hmm. And those types are later the ones that form groups like the Smithsonian or UNESCO or something like that.
Absolutely, man. Because it just becomes a funneling system to just dump on us whatever they want to dump. That's pretty much what it is, man.
People were asking me what I thought these drones in New Jersey were, and I'm not going to go down that whole rabbit hole. It's probably actually a pretty easy answer, but I just think they're man-made, by the way. But like, I do think that they are trying to establish this new reality where everything is monitored. And so that's the next step. That's also what these people try to plan, is how they're going to control you in the future. And pretty soon, your smart city is just a digital prison.
Absolutely, man. I completely agree. So to get to the Kinkaid's cave, it's originally said to be uncovered by G.E. Kinkaid and also Professor S.A. Jordan, who that is the one that I put into Google, and the AI basically told me that he existed. So that was interesting because I put in G.E. Kinkaid's name in, and they said he was a false person. He didn't exist, basically. But according to mainstream, Professor S.A. Jordan did exist. And it said that he was sent to the Grand Canyon by the Smithsonian Institute to investigate the information that was reported by who? John Wesley Powell, who we were just talking about. So Powell was down in the Grand Canyon as well. He was digging around and found a bunch of Egyptian artifacts as well. Around the same time, G.E. Kinkaid, who is said to have served with the Marine Corps, and after he retired, he worked for S.A. Jordan as an archaeologist. So he wasn't originally an archaeologist, but he ends up connecting with Jordan and they end up working together. And this is when they find this cave that they said was man-made and was around 3,000 years old. They said it was like 500 feet long, had several cross tunnels, large chambers, and the last level was an Egyptian tunnel city that they built in the Grand Canyon. And this lends to what you were saying earlier about entrances to inner earth. So were they building cities underneath the earth for a couple reasons, right? Maybe they were trying to have some sort of protection from Nephilim that are running around in the area. Also, you've got these entrances to the underworld where the gods abide. So that's a whole other reason. But the more I dug, the more I realized that I don't think that all of these Egyptians that went over there to set up shop, at least initially, were on the gods' side per se. There is a great argument, and I'm about to show you some very interesting information here about how that Joseph from the Bible, who had risen to second in prominence to Pharaoh, was one of the first catalysts to set up shop over there because of the ability to grow where they wanted to grow grain, where they wanted to grow produce, all the things that Joseph was trying to do before the 7 years of famine. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then jump back to Kinkaid's cave because I think it's important to talk about Joseph and his whole setup in how that he came into power and why that he might have ended up over there in what we now know as the United States, but the Americas. Now, the story starts with Joseph being left for dead by his brothers. They end up selling him into slavery. He gets bought by an Egyptian officer and captain of Pharaoh's guard named Potiphar. Potiphar's wife tries to have sex with him. Joseph ain't having it. Potiphar ends up throwing him in prison. And if you know anything about Egyptian culture, if somebody's trying to have sex with your wife, you would have killed them. So that lets you know that Potiphar probably knew his wife was pretty scandalous, and he was just saving Joseph's life in this case. Like, oh, I can't tell her she's lying. I know she is, but I'm just going to throw you in prison, and at least you'll be okay. So he actually rises up to prominence in prison and ends up running the prison with the guards there. And there's a cupbearer and a baker that work for the king. They get thrown in there and they have these dreams. And he basically tells the cupbearer that because of your dream, you're going to go working with Pharaoh again. The baker, he tells him that they're going to see that what you did was wrong and they're going to kill you. And that happens. Now, the cupbearer tells Joseph he's going to remember him, and he doesn't until Pharaoh starts having some weird dreams and he remembers Joseph. So they bring Joseph up to talk to Pharaoh because none of his magicians can figure out his dreams, and to not get deep into what the dreams were. But the outcome was Joseph told him that there will be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. A lot of Christians in general, because some of them read the Bible, they think that this was a famine in Egypt. This was a global famine. That's why it was so important. This was a global famine. He told Pharaoh that. This is why that they needed to start creating these giant warehouses and giant storehouses to store food during this time of plenty, because it was going to be uncontrollable plenty. So Pharaoh believes him, and because of this, he puts him in command right underneath him and puts him in command of creating all these storehouses, creating all of these warehouses to house all this food. Because one of the things that Joseph tells him is that not only are we going to need food for the Egyptians, but we're going to need food for the world. We're going to need food to be able to help people globally at this point. So Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath Paneah, and this is important because this is going to come back up when it comes to the Kinkaid caves. So he gives him his Egyptian name, and Joseph takes charge over everything at this point. Now, there's a verse that comes up when the famine begins, and this is in Genesis 41, and this is the back end of Genesis 41. And it says, when the famine had spread all over the land, this is after the 7 years of plenty, this is when the famine's hitting, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt, and every nation came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth. So it's letting you know that this is a global famine. This is probably something that may have never happened again since then. When you really think about this, this was a global famine. So if we're thinking about it in that context, and we're thinking about it in a way that Joseph would have been preparing for the future of the world because God put him in this position, then we have to look at what he might have been cultivating all over the place, because it wouldn't have just been in Egypt. Can you imagine trying to take care of the world with just the limited resources you'd have in Egypt? That might be good enough for the Egyptians, but it wouldn't have been good enough for the world. Now, interestingly enough, back to the Kinkaid's cave, there were some crazy claims that came out of it, but when we look at it from this lens of this famine back then, there were Egyptian artifacts and notable figures such as Setaprine, Keon, who is a descendant of Joseph, Akhenaten, who was the father of Setaprine, who also would have been a descendant of Joseph. There were figurines of them, even figurines of Solomon in there. So the shrine was said to be inside the cave, held the Hebrew Semitic sun, adjoined to the sign of Keon, holding a staff of the Lord in one hand. Since Keon is a descendant from Joseph, it was written that Joseph ruled the Ten Commandments, and that would mean that a descendant of Joseph was honored here. And there was another artifact found in the tunnel system, and it emulated Amunet, and Kinkaid claimed to have found burial chambers containing what he stated were Egyptian mummies in the cave. But I found it interesting that some of the claims that came out around that time, that there were descendants of Joseph in there. As a matter of fact, I'm going to get to this in a minute, there were some caves where there were depictions of Joseph himself in the caves holding a artifact, a sign of the Lord. As a matter of fact, there were hieroglyphs with the Ark of the Covenant on them in these caves that were coming out of not only the Kinkaid caves, but the Powell caves and some of the other ones that we'll talk about here. But I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And some of the guys that have done some of this research are Thomas Horn, who RIP, had done some fascinating work on some of this. Steve Quayle, also another one. So if people are looking to find some of the info that I'm talking about, these guys did an inordinate amount of research on digging up some of this info on this connection between Joseph's Egypt and these caves and this Egyptian culture that is found there. So the idea is that Joseph was sending out emissaries all around the world, and they basically found a bunch of land that they could grow crops, and it was a way to connect to this other side of the world. Not only that, but if we want to dig into the idea that Ophir, which in the Bible is talked about a place where Solomon was gathering gold. We know this from Genesis 10, where Ophir's first talked about, and Joktan, this is verse 26, and Joktan was the father of Almadad, Selopheth, Hazamarth, Jerai, Hadaram, Ophir is one of his sons. And because of that, when they spread out, and these are the clans of Noah's son, according to their generations and nations from the nations of the earth spread out after the flood. His son Ophir spread out, and it said that Ophir, wherever he went, he set up this place where there was all this gold. We know in 1 Kings 9:28, they sailed to Ophir and imported gold from there, 420 talents, and delivered it to Solomon. So there's all these ideas of where Ophir could be. We know that Sumatra's talked about, Malay's talked about, Sri Lanka, it's talked about, different places in India, the Philippines, Africa. I mean, they have talked about so many different places where it could be, but one of the places that they don't talk about a lot is the Americas. As a matter of fact, Christopher Columbus himself identified the Americas with Ophir when he came here because of the amount of gold that was coming out of it. So we know that Egypt, more than likely, if we suggest that Ophir, this place that Solomon came to gather gold, and this is obviously after Joseph, so this has been a lot later. But if this is a place where he came to gather gold, there would have been those same resources here when Joseph was here. So it would have made sense. Now, this is me speculating, so I'm going to jump out and speculate a little bit on this. But let's just say Joseph is doing God's will, and he is also connecting to the world around him because he knows he's going to have to help them. What better way to sell going all the way to the Americas to Pharaoh when you can say, well, yeah, we've got all of these minerals, we've got gold, we've got all of these things that you're going to need. But while I'm over there, I'm going to go ahead and set up places to cultivate food and be able to stockpile even more food here in Egypt as a part of that.
That sounds insane. Sounds awesome. I've never heard of that. That sounds absolutely crazy, and I love it. One thing that I'm immediately curious about is I somehow missed where these figurines were found. Where did they find them?
So those were found in Kinkaid's cave.
Okay. So is all of this mentioned in the article, or do you have other areas you're pulling this from?
It's not mentioned in the article. So this was the claims that came out, the oral claims that came out when they were pulling these items out of the cave to go to the Smithsonian. So you're right. So you've got oral claims that are all around this. Now, the article itself it's a very short article. I think you've probably read it by now, and it's not super long. They do speculate a little bit there, but they are pretty on point with how big different rooms were, what was in different rooms. They talked about several different items. But when it came to the actual artifacts that were found, these were the claims made from Kinkaid himself. These were the claims made from Jordan himself. And in all honesty, I lean to the fact that they probably were saying all this. They probably were telling people this. But if you have an organization who's trying to cover all this up, they're going to distance themselves as much as possible. So that has been passed down, and this has come from Thomas Horn and Steve Quayle, who have talked to some of these people that have been involved with at least connected to somewhere in their lineage to this whole episode of what was found in these caves. But I found it interesting that it wasn't just Egyptian mythology that was found in there, but it was odes to Yahweh himself, that there was Hebrew symbols that were also in there, and figurines that were of the lineage of Joseph. It really blew my mind when I was digging through this, and I really started thinking about the way that Yahweh thinks, the way that God thinks, and knowing that this massive famine was coming to, almost like a reset. We're just talking about a reset. Here's this global famine, and God puts a Hebrew in a station very high up with these Egyptians to then help the world. And then here's this info coming out of the Kinkaid cave with artifacts of Joseph and his family, which is pretty mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also something that like clicked in my head was when you were mentioning, like, Joseph is gonna use the new world as, sort of this new area to go to, but he's gonna do it by convincing the Pharaoh at the time, whoever it was. I don't know. I'm sorry. But he was going to convince him that this is a place of gold. It's kind of quite the coincidence that there are lots of stories of cities of gold, like El Dorado and stuff like that in North America. You know what I mean? Like, and we hear those stories of the Spaniards coming up from the south too. And it's my opinion that they might have come across some of these types of cities as well. And when you look at Colorado, that's definitely a location where a ton of gold has been found. And that would be a very mineral rich location for these Egyptians to go to convince the powers that be that this is a good, profitable place to be. My question is going to be, what happened to them? Did they retreat inside? Were they killed off by the Nephilim, or did they go home? What do you think?
I don't know. That's a very good question, because we know that just from some of the info that's there, and if we suggest that the Egyptians were here, that if it started around Joseph's time, maybe it ended around or a little after Solomon's, because that's kind of the last person that we see etched in the hieroglyphs is Solomon. We've got this Joseph, this starter, because I'm going to talk about these two other caves, where in one of these caves that there were artifacts of Joseph himself. That it seems like that's the start. But it seems like after Solomon, there's not a lot of odes to any other monarchs, if that makes sense. There were a ton of Egyptian pharaohs in between both of them, but it seems like that's the start and that was the end. So I don't know if maybe Solomon, and again, this is all conjecture, so anybody that's listening right now, we're just spitballing right here, but I don't know if I don't know if Solomon may have pulled everyone out from these mines around that time. I don't know. Maybe somebody after him, maybe one of his sons. I don't know exactly how that works. So it's possible, but that's one that I don't have an answer for at all. Yeah. It's just pure conjecture,
does, right? Except maybe the Smithsonian,
right? For sure. And to get to Powell, which was another cave that was found in the 1860s, and this is from John Wesley Powell, who we've been talking about. Inside was a shrine to Setapreen, as well as a small tablet hollowed out caves with Egyptian relics. It was filled with hieroglyphic writings, this particular tablet, one of which showed the second land of Egypt, named by Zapna, which is Joseph, and one carving that showed the Hebrew symbol for the Ark of the Covenant. The cave was said to display many hieroglyphics identical to those that appear in Egypt, representing multiple pharaohs. Powell alleged reporting his findings to the, guess what, Smithsonian and the U.S. Department of Interior. At that point, nothing else was heard of the matter. Literally got tossed under and brushed under the rug after Powell came to the Smithsonian and the U.S. government with this info. So I think it's two-part. I think that you're right. They do cover up this idea of the Nephilim and the giants for sure. But there's another part too. This would be a significant find in biblical history. So if you found a cave with a shrine to one of Joseph's descendants with artifacts, hieroglyphs, speaking of Joseph himself. They don't want that out, man, because the Bible's mythology to them. They want to spin that narrative to where the Bible is fake. And it makes sense that the Nephilim aren't the only reason that they want to hide some of this stuff that's been going on in North America or just Americas in general. I think this is another reason. I think biblical history. And I know people will say all the time, like, oh, the Bible, you can't prove anything in there. A lot of stuff's been proven out of the Bible. As a matter of fact, it's one of the top resources when it comes to historical finds throughout history. But then we got to ask ourselves, what else has been found, John, that we don't know about that could prove the Bible even more emphatically that they've just hidden?
I mean, I don't know. I cover a little bit of this topic actually, coincidentally, when I do my episode for the confessionals, my guest host thing that I'm doing, and whenever I'm doing it. But I don't know what else they've hidden, but I think that whatever it is, it's definitive proof that God is who he says he is. Yahweh is real. And I think like like a lot of the times where people get caught up and when it comes to all these mysteries and the weird narratives and the stuff like that, like at the end of it, the question is always why? Okay, great. Why cover it up? What is so tragic about knowing that the Egyptians maybe came to North America? Like, they barely let us have Leif Erikson getting to North America. Like, they barely allow us to have a Viking possibly came over from freaking Iceland, which is not even that far from here, right? Like, they're just like, oh, maybe, we don't know. But I mean, they do know now. But for a long time, they were like, it's possible Leif Erikson maybe didn't come here, whatever. But it's funny to me that at the root of it all is, well, we're not going to cover up all the mythologies from everywhere else. As a matter of fact, we will even let these Native American oral histories, which tell of giants and deeply spiritual things going on in North America, we'll let those exist because I hate to say this, but this government, if they wanted to, would have just left no survivors. To the victor be the spoil. To the victor be the story. He gets to determine what happened when he defeated his enemies or, committed genocide, whatever. But the answer is always, you can't know for some reason that Yahweh exists. You cannot know that the Bible is truth definitively. And that is the master truth. And I think there is some minor truths too, like you can't know that the earth can be lived inside. Like you can't know that you can just find a cave somewhere in the world, and if you go deep enough, you're going to find an advanced civilization deep down there, which personally I don't have any proof. Nobody does, but I think there's something down there. And is that really it though? Is what I'm trying to get at here is it really, does it really just come down to that? They can't allow the Bible to be proven. Do you think that's what it is?
I think that's one of the reasons for sure. I think the Nephilim or giants in general, I think that also proves the Bible because giants are talking on the Bible, but it also really disrupts their theory of evolution at that point. So they have a tough time with showing giant bones because they're supposed to, for all intents and purposes, they would be the evolution of us. So why would they be before us if it just doesn't add up, right? So there are too many things that they hide because they don't want us to know the actual truth. And I think the actual truth is the Bible's real.
So, and also I had another one here that I'm going to try to say as well as I can. But what do you think actually happened when these Egyptians came here, allegedly? Do you think they actually had cities above ground, or do you think that they were all underground? Do you think there may have been some, like in your research on this topic, do you think there was some kind of great war that took place in North America and that's why it's so barren here? Or like barren in the form of civilizations. I mean, obviously it's a land of plenty, but when it comes to the civilizations that were here, the Cahokia, the Egyptian, the Anasazi, these major empires, and you take into consideration the fact that we've only started asking these questions within the last 250 years. Keep that in mind. Like the late 1800s is when all of these explorers and all of these Smithsonian types started coming out of the woodwork for some reason. Didn't happen in the 1700s or the 1600s. It happened in the 1800s specifically. And of course, there's outsiders here and there, but the majority of them came then. Do you think that that was when the narrative changed and there was a great battle going on here? Or was there just nothing?
So I would probably lean toward the idea of there have already been some sort of massive battle that probably happened because of there being some of these very barren places. And you were talking about, would they live above ground or underground? Maybe a combination of both, right? So I think there was a lot of mining going on. And if we have these caves like Kinkaid's Cave and Powell's Cave and Burroughs Cave, which I'll talk about in a minute too, they had all these artifacts in there and mummies. So I think that there would have been mummification sarcophaguses put in these places where they would keep the dead. There might have been cities under there too. It's a huge possibility. But I also think they were above ground because one of the places close by to the Grand Canyon is the Kiba Plateau. And the Kiba Plateau is said to, if we wanted it to, it could feed up to 500,000 people because of the resources on that plateau. So it's close in proximity to the Temple of Set, Temple of Horus, Temple of Osiris, Kinkaid's Cave, all of the cavernous systems that have these artifacts. So what I started thinking about was, you've got this place that you can grow whatever. If Joseph came here to not only gather resources for Pharaoh, like gold and other minerals, he would have been setting up places to harvest as well. And think about this now. He wouldn't have taken all that food back to Egypt. Some, but he would have set up storage units here, for lack of a better word, more of a modernized word for what it was. Like, storage here to be able to distribute here, because the Egyptians would have also been here. And it would have been an easier way for people in the Americas to get to the Egyptians that could give them food too. That's just my initial thought on it.
It's all very, very interesting. Oh, man. I just want to know. One of these days, I'm just going to go to the Grand Canyon and just start walking.
Yeah, I want to. And, we'll just get pushed out as what's going to end up happening at some point, for sure. I think one of the interesting things, and before we get out of here, I was going to talk about the Burroughs Cave. This was a more modern cave. It was supposedly found in 1982 by Russell E. Burroughs. And this was in southern Illinois now. So this is a little bit different than being in the Grand Canyon. So this was another location that all of these artifacts were supposedly found. Now, obviously, this guy got discredited as much as possible. I mean, they threw the book at this guy because it was more modern. And for everything that has come out of the Smithsonian about Russell E. Burroughs, he was a hoaxer. He was never an archaeologist. He was actually a former prison guard, but he just discovered this cave. And in this cave was symbols and etchings that were of Zaphnath himself, Joseph. There was detailed stories and hieroglyphics that showed overcrowding in Egypt and migration to the New World that would become the second land of Egypt, or the land of Ophir. The Egyptians acquired grain and gold from this land to take back to the homeland for storage. So exactly what I was just talking about, how they were taking some of the food back and they were taking these minerals back like gold. In this cave, very similar to the Powell's Cave, there were drawings that exhibited the Ark of the Covenant, which was 100 years after Joseph. So this would have been in more of a connection with Solomon. So you can tell that Solomon had basically just found out where all this was at and gone back over there.
And I mean, Solomon, you have another example of somebody who definitely had watcher tech. So I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah, like he probably was seeing things nobody was seeing. So,
and in this cave, there were coins impressed with the image of Zaphnath, which is Joseph as well, holding the staff of the Lord with the sign of the pyramid next to the symbol for the number 2, indicating this was the currency for the second land of Egypt. So they had their own currency. As a matter of fact, back to what I was talking to you earlier about, and I was waiting to say it now, there were storage units found that they potentially used for grain and all kind of other harvests. So this is in 2 locations now that we found. There's all these tunneling systems in the Grand Canyon with all of these Egyptian artifacts. Then we're in southern Illinois, finds this cave. Here's what I find interesting too about that, man. I love how they say that it's a bunch of BS, that Burrow didn't know what he's talking about. He got discredited. But do you know that they refer to southern Illinois as Little Egypt to this day?
Yep, I do, because I used to deliver there when I was driving truck, man. And that in Illinois is where they have that mock city of Giza. Like they love Egypt there.
It doesn't make any sense, John. Like, why would you lean into something more for no reason?
Right.
It doesn't make sense. Why is it that the people naming these places, who from all indications are connected to governments, they make sure that they name it correctly? Yep. And then they'll flip back and say, oh no, this is just, making it sound cool.
And people are always like quick to just be like where you find it is weird too, like Illinois. But they don't think about the idea that being there would actually be an extremely beneficial place to be, because you're still in very fertile farmland, which I assume it would have been the same back then. But you're also on a main trade route to the Great Lakes, which is where copper comes from. And one of the most massive copper deposits has been discovered to be mined in North America. And they're like, who mined it? If somebody did, so it's probably those cultures. And at the end of the day, it's like we were saying before. I live in Wisconsin, man. Like I'm right now not, these days, one of my hobbies is investigating this mound that's just across the river from me, because I believe it's an Indian burial mound. And Wisconsin has had a host of burial mounds. I think it's the burial mound capital of the United States. And they've found many giants in them. And these giants, some of them were actually in caskets. Some of them actually were mummified. And when the Smithsonian came here and they found all that out and they became an organization, they had to control the narrative. So they rewrote it all. They hid all this from us. And the only way that we're ever going to discover the real truth, besides just waiting for it to come, because we will know someday, is going to be to go out there and try to see it ourselves. And that's honestly what I encourage everybody to do.
Yeah, I encourage people to, but there are a lot of people that don't want to do that. And I get it too. It's dangerous, and stuff we do lends more on the dangerous side. And sometimes people hear about some of the crazy stuff I do out in the woods, and they're like, what in the world? And I don't really think about it that way. To me, it doesn't feel dangerous, but I guess in if I take myself out of my little bubble and look into it, I guess it is kind of dangerous. And I think that's why a lot of people do, don't want to do this, because they don't want to, die.
Well, there also has to be a level of conviction, like a lot of people aren't as convicted as maybe you or I am. And so like a lot of people think this stuff is interesting, and maybe it is true, but it's not important enough for them to go look. And that's totally fair. And that's why we do what we do. So, yeah, man. I mean, even like, I was just thinking about this. Even Abraham Lincoln said that he mentioned the Nephilim inadvertently when he mentioned the giants who looked upon Niagara Falls in the days of old. And it's just like all these little things that combine. And it's just like, if Abraham Lincoln believed in Nephilim, why wouldn't I? He's even further back, and he's actually in that time period when the Smithsonian was covering stuff up, when they were paying farmers to dig up mounds, because why not? And oftentimes they didn't even want what was inside the mounds. They were like, it's just trash, throw it away. And then other times, they scooped it all up. But literally paying farmers to dig up the remnants of the ancient civilization that was here before you is diabolical, man. And so that in of itself just tells me everything's been hidden. And the only way that we're going to find out is, by digging it up ourselves and keeping it a secret, because we can't tell anybody, we'll be killed. Or, waiting for the day that, we get our redemption.
I totally agree with that, man. And I think that's the fun part about what we do. And again, that's why I wanted you on the show, because you not only go out and look for the stuff like we do over at Merkle Media, you also do a lot of research too, like myself. And I can appreciate that, because it's nice when you have a backbone of research as you're getting boots on the ground in these places too. You'll have a deeper understanding a lot of times of what you run across. And I can say that for sure in August, when I was traveling all over the place shooting this documentary called Crowley's Melonheads, Children of the Beast. And some of the stuff we found, I was able to correlate it to a lot of research I'd already done. So when I ran across certain things, I'm like, man, I know what that is. This is wild. Why is this here? This shouldn't be here. So, I think that's the fun part. But yeah, man, I had a blast with this episode. I've been wanting to talk about Egypt and America, and not Egypt being America. So I thought this would be a lot of fun to do, and I figured you'd be the right guy for it. And you brought a lot of really good stuff today, man. Really appreciate it. If you can, let everybody know where to find you and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I had a great time, man. This was a really fun discussion, so I'm glad we could make it work. But if you guys want to follow me, you can just search up 21CD. It stands for 21st Century Dystopian. You Google either one and you'll find me. I also have a website, 21cdstudios.com. My main platforms are YouTube, Spotify, and Apple, but I am everywhere on YouTube. All of my episodes are pretty in-depth video content. So I've got pictures and videos and sometimes dialogue from sources on the ground in wherever I'm studying. So that's how you can find me. And can't wait to see you.
Yeah, man, you got a great YouTube channel. So I encourage anybody to go over there and check out the stuff there for sure. And I had a blast, man. I can't wait to do it again. And for anybody that's listening to this on this Friday, make sure on Tuesday you go over and listen to the confessionals, because John will be hosting confessionals and he'll be talking about the Ark of the Covenant. I've already seen the show art for it, so I already know what it's about.
What'd you think?
It's going to be dope. Make sure you guys check it out. And I appreciate it, John.
You got it, man. See ya.
All right, guys, we're going to read some 5-star reviews on the way out like we always do every week. We're going to start with Apple Podcasts. We have LBM906. Great information, great voice, and the information is delivered in an excellent fashion. Appreciate that, LBM906. We have Kurt and AZ. Love this podcast. Joel's awesome. This guy's brought up so many interesting subjects on his podcast. I've grown up in a Christian household. I went to church, but the things Joel brings up from the Bible has brought growth and insight into subjects I used to think were boring. The church needs to do better. I realize I need to do a better job researching. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Kurt and AZ. I completely agree with all that. We have Garquan Gargoyle Master. Hey, dog, came from Tony's show. I'm going to binge this. Also, Bigfoot is a Nephilim. Maybe. Some of them. I don't think all of them, though. All right, we're going to go to Spotify. We have Okok Gzoff. I used to loathe Christians. Joel, you are one of the people who has changed my mind about people who identify as Christian. Isaac Weishaupt was the first. Tony was the second. Then I found you. Merkle Media really opened my world up to podcasters like you guys. I was almost black-pilled, but now I'm hopeful for 2025. Great positive vibes and intelligent conversations. Appreciate that, Okok, if you're right. You need to live your life with positivity and not live in this despair that they want us to live in. We've got Shirley Matos. I saw a few Mandela effects happen in front of my face, but I just thought it was a logo change or was something that could be explained. But then I saw more and more people and more effects happen, the more I believe in the Mandela effect. And I'm assuming that you listened to the Mandela Project episode. And I think people know how I feel about that. I do think a lot of it's false memories or things that they create to make us think that they're changing things. But I'm still open-minded to me being wrong about some of that too. We've got Sean Vanderfort. I'm a heavy machine operator, so I listen to podcasts all day at work. And your show is my favorite so far. Great content, 5 stars all the way. Appreciate that, Sean. We're going to go to YouTube. We've got Brother Heck 2403, 2 months and 18 days clean and sober. Your podcasts and similar ones are what keep me grounded while I'm laying in bed in rehab. Appreciate that, Brother Heck. That means a lot. And it's good that you are on a way to recovery, and everyone has issues and everyone has problems that they deal with. And it's good to see that you're working through that. We've got Henry Fonseca 4198. Joel, that Free the Rabbits track is so good, bro. I can't stop hearing it. Even when I'm not watching your pod. Shout out from South Texas. Appreciate that, Henry. We've got Kaylee Crow 4048. Thank you for sharing your stories, Joel. And she's referring to the paranormal stories I just told on my last podcast. If you haven't heard that, go back and listen to it. Again, guys, I really appreciate the 5-star reviews. They help grow the show. I can't say that enough. The show has grown exponentially since I started it, and it's because of you guys. Really appreciate it. We're going to listen to Shut Up and Drive on the way out. And you know what it is, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
Away from enemies, from revenge be near. To avenge my peers, I confess my sins right here. When a pelican swim and the great whites fly, aboard Noah's Ark and enjoy thy ride. But the matrix don't care, we enjoy cloud 9. 6'3" Nicola, no order particular. DeLorean dreams of the crack cell, but we know the crack gon' sell. So if it's a variable, don't work well. I wasn't here when Reagan was a cartel. Push a bar, do I rap, do I sing, do I preach, I don't know. Do I lack anything via love? No, I don't. But we gotta be a warrior too, cause that's just what warriors do. Baby, you cannot fool me with the eye. You get them every single time. I tell her shut up and drive. Baby, you cannot fool me with the eye. You get them every single time. I tell her shut up and drive. Staring up at Olympus, tight spear back of pretentiousness. Decades is vintage, new Babylon built on contentiousness. Clash on the road to Rome, we're gladiators who broken, but ain't no breaking us all.
They just wanna take the air, incode, download the air, teleport the chopper. I'm a rebel like here, double helix intravenox with Jesus. I'm a chimera, looking at these golden years flying by fair force. They cutting it off for the food too. Analytics they used to recruit you. War's a painting that sets on your Sun Tzu. They don't want the individual, just a carbon copy. True spitting that manicotti, yeah, I'm talking saucy. All they wanna build is a prison world full of pet Tamagotchis. Living kamikaze, got me out of body like I'm Goku SS3. They wanna push me to the center like a cell. They wanna spin up at the center of the nexus, me.